Hello and welcome to the final part of my Xinshi Hobby Sturmtiger. In this video I will do the painting and weathering. The painting process always starts with a layer of primer, and like my previous builds I will use the Mr. Hobby Finishing Surfacer with Mr. Color Leveling Thinner. I found that this primer is the best one that I've used as it gives really good coverage while still being thin and smooth enough to show the texture clearly underneath. I spray the primer over the entire model, including the tracks and the wheels. Next I paint the base camouflage colour, German dark yellow. It's probably not exactly correct as I just mixed it together from a few Tamiya paints rather than buying a specific pre-made colour, but it works for me. Again, this is painted over the entire model. I wanted to mask where the fenders would have covered so that when I paint the next camouflage colours, it will look as though the tank was painted with the fenders attached. Putty was used to cover the areas where the Zimrit has been worn off. I wasn't sure which colour to use in these areas that would still look good. I was considering using red oxide primer but decided against it as I thought it would be too much and it wouldn't look nice. Instead I decided to keep it as the German dark yellow colour. We could say that the crew would have painted over the areas that had Zimrit removed, or that the colour was there before the Zimrit was applied. Next I added the olive green colour, again not using an exact colour, just one that I think is close enough. This time made from XF4 and XF67. For this I use a 0.2mm airbrush as I don't want the edges to be too soft. The next camouflage colour is red brown, made from XF7 red and XF64 red brown, again with a 0.2mm airbrush. The pattern I'm using is not from any specific vehicle, it's just made up, but I am trying to copy the style from the German ambush camouflage. With the base camouflage colours completed, I start adding post shading with XF64 red brown and XF1 black. A very thin layer is sprayed around all of the details. Now I add some lighter shades of the base camouflage colours to add some variation and to blend the post shade layer. The next step is to add some dots of the dark yellow colour over the red and green. For this I used a brush and Vallejo acrylics. When adding these dots I tried to make sure to keep the dots an equal distance apart, but also trying to keep the positions random. For the yellow part I dotted over the same green colour. I couldn't mix the same colour with Vallejo acrylics that I had at the time, so I used Tamiya paints instead. They were thinned with Tamiya thinner. The camouflage painting stage is completed now. I want to seal it with varnish and prepare for the decals, so I spray a couple layers of Vallejo gloss varnish. The kit comes with transfers, but they are not real German markings, which is what I wanted. Instead I looked at some spare transfers from old kits and found a couple of German bar cross markings that I can use. To prepare the area where I will add the decal, I first apply Mr. Marksetter. Then, after a couple of minutes, I put on the decal and move it into place. Finally, I applied a couple layers of microsol to soften the decal and make it fit better to the surface. I leave the decals for at least a day to ensure that they have dried and set fully. After this I spray a layer of Vallejo varnish over the entire model. This helps to protect the decals and provides a more realistic amount of glossiness for the model. I find that the Vallejo varnish is a little slow to dry, so to avoid dust from getting stuck in the varnish, I usually spray thin layers and then immediately blow air from the airbrush to speed up the drying time. I use a lighter shade of the base colour and a fine brush to paint over some of the small parts such as bolt heads. This step helps to highlight some of these smaller details. Now I start adding the mud texture using the same combination that I usually use: silica sand, brown pigment powder, water and acrylic thinner. This is applied to the running gear and blended with water. I tried to keep it mostly random but with bigger accumulations towards the back of the tank. I also add a little on the side of the tank where the mud has been kicked up by the tracks. For the tracks I make a more watered down version of the mud mixture and apply it all over the outside of the tracks. After this I painted the inner part of the gun barrel a dark steel colour which was made with Vallejo acrylics, black grey and metallic steel. Next I start working on the paint chipping. First I use a sponge to add light chips. The colour that I use is a lighter shade of the dark yellow colour which is made from Vallejo acrylics. I add the light chips over the entire tank, putting more in areas that will be handled more, such as handles and edges of the tank. I use a very thin brush to connect some of the patches that were created by the sponge and to add additional chips and scratches where they're needed. After this I use a rusted steel colour made from black and red Vallejo acrylics. This is painted inside the light chips and represents where the chipping has gone through to the metal. Next I paint some of the smaller details like the hull, machine gun barrel, vision ports and tools. For the pistol port plugs I decided to paint them an off-white German interior colour. If you know what the correct colour is then please let me know because I couldn't find anything about it online. For the chain I painted it a dark rusted steel colour. Around the edge of the zimmet I wanted to add paint chips to distinguish it from the area without zimmets. To add these chips I only used a brush because of the small area. The colour for the light chips is the same as before, but for the chipped zimmet I use a dark brown colour. I sealed in all of the brush painting with a couple of layers of Vallejo satin varnish. I wanted to add some dust to the model, so to do this I first sprayed a couple of layers of MIG chipping fluid over the tank. In the past I've tried using hairspray for this chipping effect, but I found that I was never able to get it quite right. Either there wouldn't be enough chips, or the paint would crack. After letting the chipping fluid dry for a few minutes, I started spraying over the dust colour, which is made from Tamiya XF52 Flat Earth and XF57 Buff. This was applied on the lower hull and around some of the details on the top of the tank. The same mixture was also used on the tracks, however these did not get the chipping fluid. Once the paint is dry, I start activating the chipping fluid using a brush dampened with water. By pressing the brush gently against the surface, some of the paint will be removed. I move the brush in a vertical up and down motion to make sure that any streaks that are created look normal. Around the top of the tank, the brush motion doesn't matter as much, just brushing gently around the edge of the dust layer to remove some of the paint. Again this is sealed in with satin varnish as I don't want any of the dust paint to get removed later. The next step was to apply a wash using enamel paints around all of the details. Any excess paint is removed with a brush or cotton bud dampened with odourless thinner. Next I use mud coloured enamel paints over the areas that got the mud texture earlier. I always start with the lightest colour first and add progressively darker colours. I use odourless thinner to blend the paint so that there are no hard edges. The mud coloured enamels are also painted over the tracks. I try to paint them randomly so that they're not completely monotone. For the wheels I also use the same paint but I speckle it on instead. Now using a slightly darker shade of brown I paint inside the mud to make it look more wet. After this I use a cotton bud to rub on some metallic pigment around the edge of the wheels, then I fitted them onto the tank. The tracks were then fitted as well. These include a metal rod that keeps the tracks together, allowing them to be movable. I used a pencil to add a metallic steel colour over the raised parts of the tracks that would be in contact with the ground. The pencil was also used around the edges of the metal tools. I decided that the top of the tank was a little bit boring, so I tried adding some dirt and debris using real mud fixed in place with gravel and sand fixer. I also repeated this on the wheels as I felt they weren't muddy enough. Then I used enamel paints to add mud and dust colours, starting with a light dust colour, then adding a medium brown colour. The gravel fixer that I used left the surface very glossy, so I went over it with Vallejo matte varnish. I wasn't too happy with the colour, so I went over it with a thin layer of medium brown using the airbrush, before finally going over it again with a slightly darker shade of brown using enamels. I finished the model by adding a small fuel stain and adding black pigment for the exhaust smoke. Now the Sturmtiger is completed. I'm quite happy with the end result, but the main benefit for me was trying out some different techniques, especially during the build. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to my channel.